Hi, and welcome back. In this next module, we will examine how to craft the ethical campaign message. As we learned in our first module, ethical campaigns are the ones that serve to inform the electorate. It's the campaign's task to introduce the candidate and inform the voters about the candidate's background, his or her positions on the issues, and how the candidate is different from the opponent. Today, we are going to examine how you can ethically get your message across to the voters. Political communications can take many forms. It can be mass advertising in print, on television, on the radio, over the internet, or robocalls. It can be direct mailers, interviews, stump speeches, town hall meetings, responses to questionnaires, and of course, one-on-one communications. Based on our premise that ethical campaigns are those that create an informed electorate, it stands to reason that ethical campaign communications are those that help inform voters about matters pertinent to their voting decision. Responsible communications are those that convey truthful and relevant information about the candidate, about his or her opponent, and about the issues in the race. It should be noted that communications that contrast a candidate's positions and record with those of the opponent, they are also ethical. Some may call this negative campaigning. However, so long as the negative comparisons are truthful and relevant and fair, they too are ethical. An ethical campaign is one that avoids the temptation to engage in deceptive practices. Going into a campaign, most people have a moral understanding that it's wrong to outright lie. The problem is most candidates don't anticipate the ethical choices they will have to make about communications once the campaign is in full swing. Most campaign communications have at least a kernel of truth, but in the heat of the battle, sometimes that kernel is wrapped in deception. The ethical candidate should be wary whenever a communication, while true on its face, creates a deceptive inference. The following are examples of tactics to avoid. Facts out of context. There are many ways in which a campaign can employ deceptive inferences. The most common way in which campaigns stretch the truth is to take true facts out of context. A prime example of this is citing an opponent's roll call vote without the full history behind the vote. A legislator may have a record of voting a certain way on a certain policy. However, at some point he or she may have cast a vote that, in a vacuum, looks contrary to that policy. This vote may have occurred because the legislator didn't believe that the bill went far enough to achieve the policy. Or perhaps the legislator may have to compromise his or her stance in order to pass a larger comprehensive bill on maybe, say, an essential funding matter. Regardless of the reason, the legislator's opponent jumps on this isolated vote to proclaim that the legislator is against a prime policy of issue in the race. In all of these situations, what the opponent claimed was true. The candidate did vote a certain way on a certain date. However, the inference that the vote is reflective of the candidate's record on that issue, it's deceptive. Statements out of context. Votes are not the only thing taken out of context. Often you will see ads quoting the opponent in a negative fashion. While it may be true that the candidate did say the words, the context of the quote may not justify the inference that the candidate is making about the opponent. Deceptive imagery. Visual imagery may also contribute to the deceptive nature of a communication. Even though the words are true, images can be manipulated to falsely infer something negative about an opponent or something positive about the candidate. For example, you may have seen unrelated pictures in an ad abutted together to falsely infer a relationship between the two. This is called deceptive framing. Using this tactic, political ads often infer guilt by association when a candidate's picture is juxtaposed with a picture of someone presumably despised by the voters. The conclusion being prompted is that the opponent and the other pictured individual are ideologically aligned. Photographic alterations. Photo editing can be another way that images are manipulated to create a deceptive inference. For example, the candidate's image might be photoshopped into a picture with a highly respected person, thereby implying an endorsement when none has actually been given. Visual vilification. A regrettably favored tactic in a campaign is where a grossly unflattering photograph of an opponent is selected to underscore an attack and put the opponent in a bad light. You might ask, well, why is this unethical? The answer is that a candidate's appearance has nothing to do with the issues of the race, and by using unflattering photographs, the candidate is resorting to appealing to unconscious voter bias instead of informing the voters about the issues. So why is avoiding deceptive practices important to you as a candidate? Deceptive practices and lack of truth in politics serve to diminish public trust in government on a whole. Cornell ethics professor Dana Radcliffe has identified why truth matters. She says, from a moral point of view, what's wrong with deception is that it is a betrayal of trust. You can't deceive someone unless they trust you, believing that you're being truthful with them. When you succeed in deceiving them, you exploit that trust, using that person for your own ends. Professor Radcliffe concludes that in every domain of life, such betrayals weaken or destroy the trust relationships essential to our vital institutions, including, among others, marriage and family, business, education, and representative government. Deceptive practices violate your duty to inform the voter about who you are, what you stand for, how your positions differ from that of your opponent. Deceptive practices will also harm your candidacy. In this day of fact-checking organizations and the internet providing ready access to the truth, deceptive communications are quickly and loudly denounced. Ace Smith, a longtime California political consultant, said in a 2015 talk at the Commonwealth Club of California, "The chance of a campaign being outed as deceptive by social media and watchdog groups has resulted in more truthful campaigns. It will be helpful to you and your credibility if you vet your facts and back up your assertions with documentary evidence. In order to run an ethical campaign, you must be vigilant that all communications by you and those authorized by you are free of deception." Often, however, in this day of ever more powerful independent expenditure committees, the message hasn't initiated from your campaign, but rather from an outside group. What can you do in a situation where an outside group produces an unethical communication on your behalf? Independent expenditure committees, known as IEs, are outside groups that support your candidacy and create campaign ads either supporting you or attacking your opponent. You don't have any control over the messaging by independent groups. In fact, it's against the law for you to coordinate with them. What you can do is at the very outset of your campaign, announce your commitment to truth. If an IE issues a communication that does not comport with your standards, it's imperative that you immediately and publicly announce that you don't approve of the message and you disagree with the deceptive nature of its contents. Now we're going to be joined by Jim Canine, a former California Assemblyman and a former candidate for U.S. House of Representatives.